Hello, everyone. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for kindly inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss today about multi-layer modeling of complex systems with a bunch of both theoretical and applied examples. So we live in an interconnected world. A lot of empirical and so both artificial and natural systems are characterized by interconnected units. So the fact that they exhibit in a specific type of interactions with a non-trivial pattern. And going straight to the point, since the 70s, it has been understood that seeing this type of interactions were not the full story, but just a part of the story. One of the first ones to recognize the importance of the existence of different types of connections. Actually, connections, systems consisting of other systems. Was Francois Jacob, a Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in the 74, where he was assessing that everything in biology actually is a system of systems. And you can see here a diagram representing how at multiple scales of organization one can easily jump from genes, so genetic level, through the molecular level, so metabolic pathways, etc., to cellular networks and eventually to organ networks, to build what is an organism. But this is not the only place where we, biology, where we find this type of more complex organization. Actually, we have, for instance, artificial systems like the ones made by humans. Think about the power grid, which is responsible for controlling transportation systems, how energy is distributed in the same system, telecommunications, so forth and so on. So in practice, it has been recognized that a new ingredient, if you want, was required to better capture the complexity of our universe in general, but of empirical systems in particular. And this new ingredient is multidimensionality. So here is just to provide you with some of the most representative works that appeared, I have to say, almost 1 decade ago in some cases, and now provide the basis of what we define a multi-layer network science, together with these reviews. And I strongly recommend to read, even if they are updated more or less to 2014, 2016. They are pretty complete up to their time. So if you want to know more about the theoretical foundations and also applications to a broader set of disciplines, I strongly recommend to read those papers. Let's start our talk with discussing about the representation of multi-layer networks. So they are networks consisting of layers. So that's why they are called multi-layer. And each network is encoded by a distinct layer, here encoded by a different color. And you can have interconnectivity between the layers, so different layers can be coupled together. Actually, if they are not coupled together at all, so they act as independent networks. So that's why we often call this type of system also interdependent systems. And here we usually distinguish between intralayer connectivity within the layer and interlayer connectivity across the layers. And a single node in a layer is called state node, and the set of all state nodes corresponding to the same node across the layers is named physical node. This is a representation that can be used for a variety of systems. In here, in this slide, I show how one can easily map into multi-layer and multi-level networks the roadmap from cells, so the metabolome, the proteome, the transcriptome, to the whole societies. So here you see that at each level you can have multiple layers of descriptions. Then you can jump into at a different scale. You have the cellular networks, so then you have organ networks of tissues, and at a higher level you have population, so you have the organism, a network of organisms. But then you can have this very same paradigm also for transportation systems, using more or less the same logic across scales, and you can go from the lower level of description at the level of within a city, where the layers can be road networks, bus networks, or the tube, for instance. And then you can go across scales up to describe, for instance, intercontinental transportation network for large-scale mobility. But going again to population and then to social systems, you can make other types of categorizations. For instance, you can consider the physical world, where essentially you can have behavior or disease spreading, and the virtual world, where you can have information spreading as well. You can have information spreading in the physical world, but the information I'm talking about here is, for instance, related to the type of information circulating on social systems, and different social systems here can be encoded in different layers. Let's go to the taxonomy of multi-layer networks. Many nowadays define it like a zoo of definitions, but actually it's not that complicated. I like to distinguish the multi-layer networks into two big categories. The non-interconnected ones, where you have edge-colored multigraphs. It's true that the interconnectivity here is not provided by the data, but we do know that the layers are coupled together. And then we have interconnected systems, where the type of interconnection is manifest directly from the data. So interlayer connectivity is provided by the data. And you can have simple multiplex systems, where the replicas are interconnected with each other across the layers, or interdependent systems, where the nodes are of different type across the layers, or a mixture of the previous cases. So I have already anticipated that we make this distinction between state nodes or replica nodes and physical node, and it can be shown that you can map all of this information to matrices, but more specifically to tensors. So a rank 2 tensor here is, you can think about it as the adjacency matrix to some extent. Each one encoding the connectivity of a single layer. But then you have also rank 2 tensors encoding all the pairwise interactions between the layers. So you have another bunch of tensors. And there is an elegant way to put all of this information together within a single object that is a rank 4 tensor that is called the multi-layer adjacency tensor. How can we work directly with this type of object? We use a technique that is pretty well known in the computer science and applied math community, that is the flattening of information of tensors. Actually, you can change, we change the dimension of a complex object into a less complex object while preserving the information encoded by that object. And the same is done here. We can flatten the rank 4 tensor into a big rank 2 adjacency matrix, which is usually named supra-adjacency matrix, where the intralayer connectivity is by convention put encoded into the main diagonal, and off-diagonal blocks encode interlayer connectivity. So the whole information flow is as follows. You start from the data, then you have some good reason to build a multi-layer network model for your data. You map this to the multi-layer adjacency tensor, and eventually you work most of the time, at least, operationally with a super-adjacency matrix. And what I want you to remind is that there is a trade-off between the importance of intra and interlayer connectivity. When the coupling between the layers is weak or not existent, most of the time there are no multi-layer effects. So you can analyze the system in terms of the single layers. But when this connectivity is strong, then the multi-layer effects emerge, and you cannot neglect them if you want an accurate representation of both the structure and the dynamics of your systems. Then let's move to the dynamics. There are essentially two big families of dynamics. On the one hand, we have single dynamics, where you have just one type of dynamics defined on both interlayer and intralayer links. Think, for instance, about a random walk on the top of the network. And then you can have coupled dynamics. So this is a kind of a more complicated or more complex, actually, case where you can have a different dynamics, a different dynamical process on each layer, and the interlayer dynamics couple those two or more processes together. We will see an example in practice later in the part about applications. As I was mentioning before, you can encode all of this information, even in the dynamical case, with tensors. And then you can, for instance, encode self-interactions and exogenous, endogenous interactions, and also intertwining. And you can mathematically encode all of that information in this simple way. As an example of single dynamics, instead, we think about, as I was anticipating, a random walk, where we have, for instance, the dynamics of switch between the layers, and the dynamic of jump within the layers, but between the nodes of the same layer. And once again, you can write down an equation. In this case, is the master equation for the random walk, using the tensorial notation. In this case, it's not in the compact form, but in compact form, everything is very elegant and very short and easy to be worked out analytically. One interesting result coming out when you use, for instance, this type of diffusion processes on multi-layer networks is that new phenomena can emerge. In this case, we have just two layers, and depending on how you connect the two layers, the diffusion that you will have in each of the two layers separately can be either in the aggregate representation of the two layers can be either faster or slower than the one that you observe in the multiplex or in multi-layer system. This is a general result, and here you see that there is a region, for instance, here we are considering two Erdős-Rényi networks, so two simple random networks. There is a region in the parameter space where this actually is observed, and a larger region where this is not observed, so where enhanced diffusion is not observed. So multi-layer networks can be used also to act and to enhance or to hinder, for instance, the diffusion. Again, using diffusive processes like random walks, one can define or can extend existing methodologies, for instance, to define or to identify the mesoscale organization of a network, of a multi-layer system. Here we introduced a couple of years ago the generalization of a random walk, which led us to introduce to describe flows on multi-layer networks. In this way, we were able to generalize the very well-known infomap algorithm to the realm of multi-layer systems, with all the advantages that come with this algorithm. Finally, one can still use dynamics or dynamical processes to understand if there is a possible way to reduce the complexity of a multi-layer system. For instance, in terms of the dynamics that it runs on the top of it. So here, for instance, we have been wondering about how one can couple functionally two layers or more together, for instance, with respect to random walk dynamics, but it can be generalized to any type of dynamics, in order to reduce the complexity of the multi-layer network model. And one can do exactly the same thing, but from a structural perspective. So instead of using dynamics, one can devise a purely topological algorithm to do that, in order to effectively obtain a dimensionality reduction of your data. So at this point, it's plausible to wonder if the multi-layer representation is useful for modeling and analyzing empirical complex systems. So the answer is yes. There are a lot of applications. Here we'll just describe some of the most recent ones involving me directly and my lab. Let's start from life. Where, broadly speaking, here we can ask about how one can use the multi-layer representation in order to integrate, for instance, a distinct type of protein-protein interactions. We have used a huge repository, very well known in biology and bioinformatics. And here layers encode the different types of physical and genetic information. Here there is an example for the case of the HIV-1, so it's the virus of the AIDS. And one can use this approach, this type of modeling, for instance, to better understand the relationship between the mesoscale organization of the human proteome in terms of protein-protein interactions, and how those interactions are organized into functional modules, and the relationship between those modules and disease. In this recent work, for instance, we have contributed to a huge data challenge where it was shown at the very end that in this specific case, the multi-layer network representation was comparable in terms of performance to single-layer analysis. But then we can, for instance, use the same paradigm to integrate genotype and phenotype information. Here we have used, we have built this tripartite network, if you want, where linking genes and diseases with their symptoms. Then you can project with respect to diseases both dimensions, the dimensions of genes and the dimension of symptoms. In one case you obtain, so in the last case you obtain the disease network from the phenotype perspective. So two nodes here are two diseases connected, sharing some symptoms. And in the other case you have two diseases sharing one or more genes. And then you can have your in this case it's a multiplex representation of this genome and phenotype interactions. And when you do that, actually, and you perform a community detection with InfoMap algorithm or its generalization, you can find novel or mesoscale organization for the diseases, for disease associations. And that novel mesoscale concern the integration of genotype and simultaneously of genotype and phenotype information that led to, for instance, uncover some disease interactions that were not yet known. And if you want to play, for instance, with this data set, it's publicly available online. And we can use the same idea also for to study the proteome related to COVID-19 and its virus, the SARS-CoV-2. We have recently done exactly this. We have been considering the human proteome together with the interactions between compounds, so drug protein interactions, and together with symptoms. Protein interactions and biological process protein interactions. And then we have been considering the interactions between the viral proteins of SARS-CoV-2 and their human targets. In this way, we were able to build a multi-layer representation of of the interactions between viral proteins, human proteins, diseases, symptoms, gene ontology terms, and drugs. The result is this network. It's a pretty complex one. And also in this case, the data is publicly available. There is also a nice interactive visualization that we provide, so you can directly use this data for your analysis. So for the last part of the talk, let's move now from cells. So far we have been discussing about molecular networks to societies, so to the scale of population structure and dynamics. In fact, here we can use the multi-layer representation to integrate distinct types of population dynamics, something that I was mentioning at the very beginning when talking about coupled dynamics in the representation part of this talk. So I want to discuss a few cases, very representative, most of them have in common that they are related to human behavior and human behavioral data obtained in this case by phone calls and actually specifically from call detail records. And this is one case where we didn't use phone calls, but we use other types of data generated by mobile phone users. In this case, the check-ins that users do on Foursquare. And here you can see that we use the sequence of check-ins linking different types of venues. We have distinct type of venues related to food, to tourism, to sport, to transportation, and then we link those venues, those points of interest, and those points of interest can also be linked across layers, because you can go to the restaurant after going to the gym, for instance. And we have analyzed hundreds of millions of data for 10 megacities around the world, obtaining some more information about the internal organization of those urban systems, and in particular unraveling the existence of cities within the cities. So a kind of hierarchical organization of human flows. But then you can use mobile phone data to understand where people is moving without check-ins, but using the fact that they are connected to some antennas, or by using directly the GPS data when this data is available and everything is compliant with privacy regulations. And in this case, you can have the different areas of a city or of a country or of the world, different spatial patches are the nodes of our network. It's a meta population network now because you have a population into each single spatial patch. And the layers here can encode, for instance, human mobility and human communication. When you do that, so we have done that in the past, in the last 8-9 years now, and we have discovered very interesting patterns. Let me show a few of them. In this application to data coming from the Ivory Coast within the Data for Development Challenge organized by Orange, we have developed one of the first multiplex model coupling distinct dynamics. In that case, we have exactly mobility patterns connecting distinct parts of the country, and communication patterns linking those the same areas. Then we have written down some models, so some equations for modeling the dynamics of interacting mobility and communication. And here, this you can see here, these are the coupling terms of bridging the two dynamics in order to better understand which type of policies one should implement in order to contain the spreading of a disease in that country. And in this other application, is a more recent one, we had the data about movements of both Turkish people in Turkey and Syrian refugees in the same country. And here you can see the mobility patterns. And in this case, what we tried to understand was how to couple human mobility and social integration in order to between the two populations, in order to understand if the arrival of the refugees could be considered like a public health issue for the Turkish government. And let me say that the answer is no. Actually, you don't. In the case of measles, that is the case that we have considered in this work. You have when a country, the host refugees, the last thing to do is to segregate those refugees in some parts of the country. Instead, we have demonstrated with our mathematical modeling that the best strategy is to equally redistribute those refugees in the country in order to let them integrating with the local population. In this way, you have the local population acting if the immunization level of the local population allows for that, of course, but this is the case of for measles in Turkey. The local population act as a kind of herd immunity for the refugees. And let's move to another type of application. In this case, we don't rely on mobile phone data. Here we have directly data about exchanges between householders in 3 villages of Alaska. And those householders have distinct type of jobs and activities, and the layers encode exactly those activities. So it's a kind of economic network, if you want, that is coupled, of course, with the environment. So it's a social ecological system. And in practice, what we have done was to consider some scenarios related to the climate change, like global warming and so on, and its impact on Alaska. and then mapping this impact on the activities of this multi-layer system. Like, for instance, the global warming could cause whales to migrate elsewhere, and the layer of activities related to trading fat, or the fat of whales, of course, was going to disappear. Then we have tried to quantify the impact of different type of resource depletion with respect to terrestrial or sea or riverine resource depletion. But the interesting thing here is that when we quantify the robustness of the system to this depletion, actually the system is more robust to this type of perturbation than social shift. So in practice, the loss of specific of key householders was more relevant than the loss of specific layers in this system. So this was a very interesting assessment of the risk for those villages. And as a last application, let me go to the digital domain, where we have online social networks. In this representation, here each node, each point is a user on Twitter. Links are social interactions, and this is a real data collected during a real event. And let's go straight to COVID, to the case of COVID-19. In 1 year ago now, the World Health Organization has warned that together with the pandemic, we were going to see also the spreading of an infodemic, an overabundance of information, not necessarily true, that was able to mislead people just because they were not more able to understand which type of information was reliable or not. Colleagues and other institutions have collected thousands of that type of information. They are not only fake news, they are conspiracy theories, etc. And what we have done was to start collecting a lot of data. This slide now is a bit old, but nowadays we have almost 1.5 billion tweets connected since the mid-January 2020 about COVID-19 and related terms. And in this way, we were able to, we devised a way based on network science, but also machine learning, in order to understand what the sources and to label the sources that were circulating online in this period. We have reconstructed the social network of interaction. This is just a snapshot where you see that there is a huge, a very strong mesoscale organization. Those groups encoded by colors represent entire countries or political parties. And when our analysis has revealed that there is a strong relationship between the dynamics of the virus or the epidemic spreading and the dynamics of unreliable information. That is the spread of fake news and conspiracy theory and so on. And the two of them are, so we have observed that these two dynamics one anticipate the other. So that we see an infodemic wave anticipating the epidemic one. This is phenomenon is very interesting, and it's been observed in several countries around the world. So it's something that actually it seems to be there. And in order to model also this type of dynamics, we are developing multi-layer network models. This topic is very interesting. I strongly recommend you to look around and to be informed correctly from the right sources, because there is increasing evidence that fake news and conspiracy theories and these infodemics in general is really a threat for public health. So we really need to communicate adequately overall when, as scientists, we have our discussions on social media platforms, for instance, as Twitter. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, Professor. So if anyone has any questions, you can type it on the chat window, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask the question to Prof. Tab.
Yeah, I think Gazain has one question. Maybe he can ask, and after that, I have to ask some question.
Thank you, Sarita. Yes, so thank you. Well, it was a really interesting talk and quite impressive. I just wondered about time series. So because multi-layer networks could be used to model time series as well. Do you have any examples for that as well?
Okay, so it's a good question because it's a big deal to model with time series with networks. To the best of my knowledge, there are a few attempts in this direction. There are at least two ways. One way is to use what is named the visibility graph. That is a way to map a time series into a network, and then you can use different variants of the visibility graph to encode the different types of information from the same time series to a multi-layer representation, or from multiple time series. So if you have a multivariate time series, for each time series you have a layer where the layer is the visibility graph of the corresponding time series. Another way is instead of considering directly the mapping of the dynamics of the time series, is to extract some knowledge from those time series. So for instance, using overlapping windows to find the underlying, let me say, causal relationships, but you can use not only causal methods but also correlation methods and so on. But in general, no more than that. I think it's very context dependent.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so Gazain, do you have another question? Because your hand is still up. Oh, no, okay.
No, so, thank you. I just forgot to take it down.
Okay, so Manlio, it was a wonderful talk. And of course, I have several questions, but I am just asking two. One is a bit technical and one is maybe popular kind of. So technical question is that when you construct a multi-layer network from a real time series, then the challenge which we all know lies in deciding the interlayer coupling, that multiplexing coupling strength and the type of the coupling. So how do you take care of this problem of defining this interlayer connections? That is it one-to-one, is it one-to-many, type of coupling and the coupling strength. So maybe if you would like to comment by some specific examples so that audience can also appreciate this nice framework of multi-layer networks.
Okay, so this is again a good question, and the short answer is it's still an open problem, if you want, because as I have said at some point in the talk, when you have raw data and you want to build multi-layer networks, so you have to make this effort of having in mind what your multi-layer network is going to represent. So let's talk about a very simple example. Well, the human brain. So you get some time series from the brain region. So it can be the EEG or some fMRI signal, whatever you want. And I have done in the past the frequency decomposition of these signals. So in this way, you can map the spectral coherence, for instance, so between different regions of the brain according to a specific frequency band into a specific layer. Well, at that point, you have this issue that you have to also consider the cross connectivity, so the interlayer links. And when you have to do that, you have to think about what you are going to model. So if you think, or you have some good reason, maybe driven by physiology or some other experimental results, that you can cross-connect one brain region in a frequency band with another brain region in another frequency band, then it makes sense to use a fully coupled model. Otherwise, if you don't have any reason to specify that, that will be a more complex model. So you are adding a lot of parameters to estimate if you want. Then you should opt for a more parsimonious approach, that is estimate only the cross connectivity between a node and its the same representation, so it's a replica in another layer. So this is most what I have done in the past. I have to say that we have I have participated to a very interesting study with an international pool of colleagues working exactly on this problem with brain data. And eventually, we were able to study a very specific case where we knew the ground truth from modeling the dynamics of the neural activity. And it turned out that the interlayer connection between replicas was the best approach. So forgetting about all the all-to-all links.
Yeah. So in your multi-layer approach, like the empirical data multi-layer which you have presented, you have taken always one-to-one kind of coupling.
Most of the time, yes. Most of the things that I have presented are one-to-one.
Okay.
Although the mathematical framework works also for more general things.